I am very struck by this altar. I find it quite beautiful and quite representational in terms of its reflection of Palm Sunday. I see the blue as infinity. The blue also can represent Christ in his highest consciousness. And then there's the palm fronds in that beautiful color of green. And Master said green was the color of the heart chakra. So there's the love of the people toward the Christ. So thank you, whoever put that altar together. It's perfect for Palm Sunday. This day is quite a day in the life of Christ. It's quite significant because it reveals to us the whole crux of the matter, it's sorting out, in an interesting way, sorting out what his ministry has been about. Jesus carried within him the divine light, and he also was a human being. It's hard to know. In fact, we know, that there are very few who understood that divinity and perceived that divinity, and those were the 12 disciples. So Christ came because he heard the cry of a good portion of the Jewish people, and there were two issues that were very strong at that time. As I was preparing, I was wondering, why did God send an avatar at that time? Well, we know that God responds to the call of his children, but there were actually two strong calls. There were those who were feeling the need for some kind of political liberation from the oppression of the Romans, who had total control over the Jewish population. And what they were looking for was a liberator. They wanted a Napoleon, someone to come in there and give the Jews back their power over their own business. Then there were those who really were feeling the oppression of what had become of the church in their community. They were allowed to worship in their way. The Romans didn't eliminate that from their rule over the Jews. The Jews had their temple, but look what had happened to it. It had become bound by the nitpicking rules and regulations that the priests treasured and kept in front of the people. So there were all kinds of rules for all kinds of things, all kinds of ways in which they need to follow it. And then I realized so much in this preparation for Palm Sunday, certain aspects of the day and the imagery of it came really clear to me. I never really caught on to the clearing of the money changers in the temple courtyard, how significant that was. What that represented, although it was like a little fair that was set up inside the temple, but it was serious business because this was the buying of animals in order to bring inside for the ritual slaughter, and you had to pay for them, and that money went to the priests. And it was essential that you spend that money and that you buy that animal and bring it inside for this particular ritual. And everything down the line was going on like that. And it had created a very wealthy set of ministers and rabbis, and so it was really out of control. I mean, it was just out of control. They were very pious, and they thought they were doing the right thing. Of course, people do. But it was oppressive. and it was hemming in the Jews in a way that they felt they needed much more freedom to express the feelings of their heart. And so there had been much, much prayer coming for someone to help release that hold that the church, that the synagogue had over them. So those were the two streams that were happening. And when Jesus came, so what was he doing? Whose issue was he taking up? What was going to be the end result here? And that was the unknown. And those that greeted him in Palestine, in, what was the city he came into? Jerusalem, yes, thank you. Those that greeted him in Jerusalem saw him as releasing them from the spiritual oppression, the religious oppression. They had also spent much time with him. This event, Palm Sunday, was very close to the end of his ministry, as we know. So many who really understood and felt the vibrations of the Christ knew that he was the Son of God, not just the Son of Man. They could see that divinity. And this is what they were so happy. They were afraid for him. They actually knew that the authorities could come down on him if he exposed himself in Jerusalem. He had spent most of his ministry out in Capernaum and out just visiting all kinds of communities and gathering people who felt a draw to his loving mission. And then, of course, the disciples, who were very, very key to, and this, if you look at history, if you look at the history of churches, it's often change is made by a very, very few. So here's this dramatic life of Christ, and it comes to the disciples, the 12. And to these he ministered in very intimate ways, gave them lots of understanding, lots of teaching, the ability to heal. So all of these things had been going on when he entered Jerusalem. And so there were several voices in that crowd. I mean, the joyful voices were probably the ones who, well, they were both actually, the ones who knew who he was and were happy to see him in the city, and the ones who thought he was going to be a political savior. They were also rejoicing. But it was just not to be. And for me, studying this day was very significant in terms of my understanding of this story, because I carried for many decades. Stay up here. Well, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. But Bruce could maybe make it a little bit more stable. Ooh, that's better. I guess. Okay, we'll leave it at that. Okay. I carried for a long time the thought that how was it that the Jews could reject Jesus? Wasn't that a huge piece of karma? And that's the way I carried it in my mind. The Jews rejected Jesus. That's not the story. Many, many, many of them embraced the Messiah. He was promised to them, and many saw him as that. And so it's because the story is so multifaceted, because it's political and spiritual, that we get a curious understanding. I'm delighted to drop from my consciousness the thought that the Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus. That's not fair. That's not the story. The powers that be were responsible. The Romans were responsible. But again, it's a dramatic spiritual story. There's many, many higher consciousness beings that come into the world, not always the avatars, but they come into the world to give the message to those who are ready. They're there in that wonderful way. They're there, and we are drawn. And I tested myself. I thought, and we all should do this, if Christ were to walk today in this society, would there be any way that I might recognize him? That's the thing to think about, because you have to include the story of the times. You have to include when he came and what was going on. So that morning was very complex, and Christ put himself in that danger because he knew his story from start to finish. He knew when he was 12 years old, when he scolded his parents for being concerned that he wasn't with them going back to Nazareth. He said, "Don't you know I'm about my Father's business?" So he knew who he was, and he did. He knew the whole story. And yet he followed it out. He followed it all the way to the end. And of course, we know the story of Gethsemane. When he realized now the clock had ticked, so that another force came into play, and that was Judas. Judas was playing a role that was essential. This was Christ's life. This was the way it was going to go. This is the story that would move us and inspire us and help us to understand that Christ came for our inner life. Christ came for our awakening. Christ didn't come to make society treat us better. He came for us to open ourselves to our reality. And Judas got caught in that other theme that was going on. Judas, well, he had an inner failing, actually, but he did get caught thinking that there were other ways to do the mission so that Christ could come out and have many years with them. He began to think that Jesus didn't quite have it together in terms of his choices for how to go about doing things. He felt he knew better than his guru. This is an attitude to really watch. It's a kind of pride, and it's deadly, literally. That's where Judas was. He was one of the 12, we have to always remember. And he thought, I could give Jesus a few hints about how to run this mission. I don't think he quite knows how to do this to get where I think he's trying to go. So, and again, Christ understood. The very, very interesting thing is Judas was reincarnated in the 1800s. And he was a devotee of the great master Ramakrishna. And Ramakrishna was asked by Christ to take him in and let him be a disciple. And the folks in the monastery, the other monks, made fun of him because they noticed he had a little attachment to money. And Ramakrishna said, "Don't." This is a true story from Yogananda. He said, "Don't." And he actually, I don't know whether I wrote it down, He was actually named. Saradananda. Saradananda was his name. And in that lifetime, Ramakrishna liberated him. He was liberated. So that's 2,000 years. That's an interesting thing to think about. But the story goes on. The story just goes on. And then look what's happened with Christianity. Starting with the 12, just flooded along. And what allowed that to happen was the disciples whom he trained. And he trained them with a message of love and tolerance and a love for God. All of that must be our destiny, because the world is not our destiny. No matter what we accomplish or what we do here, our destiny is that pure, loving heart, that we love the Lord with all of our mind, all of our heart, all of our soul, and all of our strength. Those words are in the Festival of Light that we'll do this morning. And those words come directly from Christ. Because when Swamiji wrote the Festival of Light, he incorporated both Sanatan Dharma and Christianity. And so Palm Sunday is significant because Christ made the decision that he was going to come right out into the issues that were troubling society at the time. And for some reason, I've read the life of Christ many times, but I never understood the whole money changer thing. And finally, I see it in the sequence. I understand. He was coming into Jerusalem to say, okay, this is it. This has to stop. There's so much more in your prayers than what it's become. Let's make this different. And the churches, the early Christian churches, starting out very simple and very dedicated. And then the world comes in, and look what's happened. You could say that many of the large churches have just taken it back on again. It's not selling animals, but it's selling all kinds of other things. And so the world just does that. I mean, we just lose track of what's trying to happen. And the avatars don't do anything but keep giving us a chance to wake up. And there's another little moment when the authorities were very embarrassed in a way about the Hosanna of Palm Sunday, and they said, tell your disciples to cool it, just don't make all this fuss. And Jesus said to them, if I did, the stones themselves would cry out. That's the wholeness of it. That's the extent of his cosmic consciousness. I want to read, I think I wrote it down for myself, but I want to read this last part of the reading this morning, which was Sri Krishna, because I think it's a reference to Krishna, but it's a reference to avatars and their state of consciousness. O infinite light, think of this as Christ. O infinite light, thy radiance spreading o'er the universe shines into the very darkest abyss. Thy voice overwhelms the roar of cosmic cataclysms. Lo, the myriad stars are thy diadem. Thy scepter radiates power everywhere.
From Whispers.
Whispers.
Just getting that to you. So Jamuna has chosen one from Whispers from Eternity, a reading here, and it's Baptize me in the flood of thy grace. I was first baptized at the font of this material world. Parental heritage gave me my body. The milk from my mother's breast baptized me to the feel of flesh. Cloud-born rains, mountain springs, and meadow-nurtured food made me dependent on earth's subsistence. My imprisoned soul cried at last for freedom from the prison of confining flesh and maternal care. No more did I want to dwell within the fenced garden of the senses. Yes, I cried for freedom. And then, at last, the cloud of silence upon me, holding thee remote, it burst, and thy mercy rained upon me, cleansing me with thy grace. The rising waters of thy spirit broke the narrow boundaries of my soul, baptizing me in thine expanding waters of infinity. The power of thy flood of cosmic consciousness broke the embankments of my senses, and every little bubble of my consciousness dissolved to be baptized in the waters of thine omnipresence.